Welcome all to another lecture in the Coming Renaissance series. This time a response to an article that went around a couple of weeks ago. So this is already old news by the standards of the machine, of course. It's also unusual for a thinker to respond to something like that, perhaps. So the article was "It's Time to Build" by a gentleman who is off Silicon Valley. And my response is, it's time to think. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for listening and tuning in and perhaps sharing the videos, etc. and leaving a comment. And I'd also greatly appreciate it if you could support the channel in any way you can. And yes, so here's my response. It's time to think. It's time to build, we are told once more. But should we not begin to think first? Should we not focus on true leisure first before we fall again into the traps and machinations and calculations of materialism and utilitarianism? The question of true leisure, of skole in the Greek sense, is not a question of what we do when we have some free time from work. Rather, this question is the question of all questions, for leisure is the basis of civilization. Plato tells us in his dialogue Critias that Athens was born on the basis of skole. When skole arrived in their midst, Athens became Athens. Skole is the ancient Greek word we usually translate as leisure. For when the Athenians had turned their mind, their thought, their nous in Greek to true leisure, they had directed their sense to the plenty, to abundance, to exuberance, perhaps even to the richness of beings, and also to an appreciation of the old ways of being and their ancestors. Simply put, their existence had become meaningful because they saw themselves as part of the chain of being. That is to say, leisure is at the heart of the true polis when the polis comes into its own. It was through thinking, through directing their sense, their nous, their understanding to a new horizon, that Athens became Athens. It is time we begin to think again, leisurely in this sense, and idly, so that we can ripen. And only then can we begin to build. Our economic systems, be they capitalism, socialism, communism, Keynesianism, whatever ism, are all predicated on fundamental lack, because that's, in a nutshell, that's modernity. Modernity is the assumption, or is the stance, that it's never enough. Everything must always be increased, and such is also the tone of the article that went around there, because it literally said we haven't had enough. We didn't have enough. Why didn't we have enough? Why isn't there enough? We need more. Yes, humans have needs. This is undeniably the case. Material needs. However, the needs with which we are concerned in our economic systems are ever only the most immediate and are only material. We only ever consider the useful, that which can be calculated. But is not meaning or sense our most fundamental need as a human being? Is not meaning utterly useless? That means outside the calculations of utility. Meaning has no place in the economic and political systems that we know today. In his last lecture, course entitled Was heißt denken? What is called thinking, or what calls upon us to think? What is calling us to think? Martin Heidegger writes the following about the hastiness and busyness of the last man, of the late modern subject, as others would say. This lecture course was given in 1951 and 1952, when the world order of this epoch was finally cemented, was finally set in stone. What is most precarious or thought-provoking, bedenklich, it is that we are still not thinking. End of quote. Now, bedenklich, which is sometimes translated as precarious, sometimes translated as thought-provoking, bedenklich means that we are invited to be guarded again by thinking insofar as we do not yet think, but only ever act. Yet Heidegger points out, are we not meeting continuously at conferences and congresses to discuss ideas about the world? Note, however, that what happens at these conferences, according to Heidegger, is this, or could be this. We are concerned here simply with ideas, which in English can mean representations, imaginations. One could say, and one could exaggerate and say that all we deal with very often, and all we have dealt with for decades, is fantasies, imaginations. We have lived in the cave. Of course, now everyone is all of a sudden interested also, very interested indeed, in philosophy and what philosophers have to say. But, as Nietzsche says in an unpublished note, modern man is always interested. Always. But only ever epidermally interested. Nothing goes through our skin. As soon as it gets serious, we don't want something that gets serious. No. Nothing goes under our skin. We are ever only briefly affected by ideas, as E.M. Forster describes the subjects in his prescient short story The Machine Stops from 1909. Hence also the article that made the rounds and that called for building, for having more stuff for the sake of having more stuff, because having more stuff means to have more stuff. For being more effective for the sake of being more effective means that one is more effective for the sake of being more effective. They're always guards, even if concealed. As active as this call wants to sound, as vibrant and loud as it was, it might have already been forgotten, of course, it's 2 weeks ago. It was, in fact, just an idea, a blimp on a screen, already now forgotten, perhaps. Perhaps no thinking will spring from it. Modern man, Heidegger writes in what calls us to think, quote, has no other choice but to search among his type of ideas for the form of those measures that are to create a world order. The congresses and conferences, committees and subcommittees, are they anything other than the blinking organizations of blinking arrangements of distrust and treachery? Any decision in this realm of ideas must by its very nature fall short. Even so, man cannot settle down in indecision to a sham peace and security. Still, the source of man's inner fragmentation remains shrouded in the shadows of an unearthly world destiny. That shroud itself is further covered up by the predominance of publicity, so that the fracture of his fragmentation does not get reached down to man in his essence, despite all the unspeakable suffering, all the distress that all too many men endure. The pain that rises from the rift of that which is does not get reach man in his essence. End of quote. But this our age, as Goethe laments in his Maxims and Reflections, is unholy, since nothing is allowed to come into its own, nothing is allowed to ripen, meaning does not flourish. A great forgetting set in centuries ago, and the reckoning has come. We are living through it, fooling ourselves that big tech companies could save the planet. We have forgotten who we are, we who do not yet remember who we have always been. It is time we allow ourselves to ripen again, and this will happen only in finding a stance in thinking. Goethe continues, this is a quote from Goethe now, "The activity of commerce, the rush and rustle of paper money, the swelling up of debts to pay debts, all these are monstrous elements to which in these days a young man is exposed." End of quote. Now what is debt other than the utter abyss, the black cloud of a future already lost, which sucks us empty and leaves our world voided of meaning? Usury, the existential trap, a tempocidal destruction of all genuine access to time and history, the freezing of our memory of who we are and have always been. The materialist response to the current crisis is to throw more money, more paper, more debt, more material into its own abyss. What Goethe sees here is what Heidegger will come to call the insatiable will to will, that wills evermore and can only give itself a ground, briefly a hold, if the will continues to will more at ever greater costs for all, and ever more force of imposing and greater effort and ever smaller dividends and yields. More stuff, more material could not have saved us either. The virus will not be scared away by material. This is another passage from the Nachlass. There is another passage from Nietzsche's unpublished notebooks from 1886, where Nietzsche writes that today we suffer, quote, and this is my translation, so please forgive me, from an abundance of disparate impressions, which is greater than ever before. And I am, of course, adding to these disparate impressions. I'm quite aware of them. The problem, however, is that this, these are my words now, abundance of disparate impressions is one of the greatest, most upheld values of today. The information age demands us to be instantly informed about everything at any time. Now, because being informed all the time is one of the greatest values today, but at the same time it's impossible for us to bear all that overflowing information. The result is, as Nietzsche calls it, adaptation. And that adaptation is necessary to even be able to cope with that many impressions. There's a reduction of man for Nietzsche that occurs. The consequence of continuous adaptation is passivity. We become, quote Nietzsche, reactive talents. Contemporary information society has its dogma. Be informed about everything all the time. But this kind of being informed, being in a certain form, which is devoid of form, reduces knowledge to information and makes us unable to act. Hence these calls to the affective, to the thymos. It's time to build. It's supposed to generate a certain reaction. But just that, and then it's gone. On modern adaptation, Nietzsche writes, quote, "Man unlearns how to act." This is again from the Nachlass, from the unpublished notes. So again, man unlearns, forgets how to act. He merely reacts to stimuli from the outside, from without. This leads to a deep weakening of spontaneity. Spontaneity means freedom. What are we, readers, today? Oh, sorry, Nietzsche calls us all, quote again, historians, critics, analysts, interpreters, spectators, collectors, readers. They are all reactive talents, all of science. It is an artificial trimming of one's nature to an image, to an idea. We are all very interested, but at all times merely epidermally interested. There is a fundamental coldness about modern man. End of quote here. And then Nietzsche ends this passage as follows. Quote, contrast, there is a contrast, a stark contrast of the external mobility, flexibility, busyness to a certain deep heaviness and tiredness on the inside. You can see this when you say, speak about boredom. Oh no, I'm never bored. I'm always busy. I'm not me. We live not in a polis, of course. That would be a mirror of a good order of the cosmos, for we have lost the cosmos. We live not in a virtuous polis, but in a virtual polis, of course. Not in a virtuous polis of fellow humans, but in an uncanny, or as I've learned from Chris, my conversation with Chris Akabuzi, in an unhomely, in a wheelwork that's unheimlich, where we are alienated, an alienating wheelwork, as Nietzsche calls our world. We exist in the grind of the quote from Nietzsche, total economic management of the earth, which is inevitably in store for us, Nietzsche says 140 years ago or so. And he says that this will be the history for us for centuries to come. And I wonder how sick, anti-human is a system that collapses when the world stands still only for 2 weeks. How fragile is such a system? Is this a world fit for humans? Is this a world fit for nature? Is this a world fit for Earth? Or is not what we are witnessing perhaps nature fighting back against the hubris of modern man? In a talk by my good friend Professor Max Gottschlich, which is also on the channel, he talks about the necessity of the liberation of nature, that nature comes into her own. For if not, we will be haunted by such events again and again. And you might know this in the history of philosophy, that the earthquake of Lisbon led to a tremendous reconfiguration of what evil means at the time. Perhaps this is also such a time where this pandemic, which concerns all people, pandemos, will lead to such a reconfiguration. But the world used to be standing still, and we have forgotten what the Greeks call skole, which is not free time that we are granted from work sometimes by the capitalists, and so that we can optimize ourselves to be functioning better at the workplace. And granted, of course, only if all basic needs are met. No, as anyone who can see what drives this planetary alienating wheelwork, the will to will that wills itself, and wills itself so. Why? Because it is so. And there's no reason given. It's time to build, but because it's time to build. How can you disagree? It's time to build. We need more because we need more. How can you disagree? We need more because we need more. Anyone who begins to see this logic, if you like, of the will to will, sees that what's at the heart of this is fundamental lack, which can never be met. Never. For the will itself is lack. Fundamental lack. True leisure, skole, does not and will never come once all basic needs and wants and desires are met. Instead, leisure itself is the cradle of who we are, of the well-ordered polis. If anything, then the past decades, if this is the amount of time we want to think back, this is the time horizon that maybe it's possible to think in. Only just these past decades, only just these past 2 decades can show us that never will basic material needs be met. There's always a new need that will be generated from that. This is why, in an essay as we're discussing here, in an article as this, in hindsight, it's possible to point out that we should have had more of certain things. But the planet has ground to a halt. The new Atlantis, and I'm making this point in reference to Francis Bacon, who, you should read this essay, The New Atlantis, where he describes modernity and what's possible scientifically. He does not call it Athens. In the Critias dialogue by Plato, Plato compares Athens with Atlantis. The new Atlantis is not sinking just yet, but it is beginning to show its fragility, which is its perception of lack at its core. Plato tells us in his dialogue Critias that Atlantis, this most magnificent city of its time, began to lose itself, its ways, when the Atlanteans directed their sense toward lack, which led them to require a continuous inflow of goods to still their insatiable appetites. More stuff did not save them. The harbor of Atlantis never stood still. They turned their days into a restless frenzy and their nights into days. An alienating wheelwork, indeed. In the same dialogue, Plato tells us, what I've mentioned before, how Athens became Athens, the polis of the goddess Athene, the garden of the fruits of which we still enjoy today. Athenians, before they became who they were, directed their sense towards lack. They had no room for the knowledge of the old before Schole arrived, of that which always has been. They found no stands to take in the midst of beings, and Schole was nowhere to be found. But once they began to reconfigure their sense, their nous towards Schole, they were able to remember their future. They were able to remember who they had always been. Schole, the spirit of true leisure, entered them, and they found the hold to ground the polis and themselves, the polis that became Athens, the true garden. With their sense directed at Schole, their spirit filled with it, Athenians turned to what Plato calls mythologia, the knowledge of the old and of the legendary. The old, as Aristotle tells us, is the name for being. Aristotle, totien enai, that which has always been being. The question of being, which we are forgetting, is the reminder of who we have always been, but the will to will blinds our eyes and hearts for this deep memory and true innering, bringing into the inner of our hearts who we are. The will to will wills us to be enslaved by debt, numb from experience and death machines. The will to will wills us to kill time rather than allowing for the wonders of boredom to disclose to us who we are. For it is in our epoch, through this horror vacui, the horror of emptiness, that means the appreciation that we are not in full control, that the empty is where something occurs, so that meaning can begin to shine forth. It is by directing our sense toward the old ways of being, then, that we can begin again to build proper cities, houses fit for humans, an oikonomia that does not destroy the earth, does not deplete meaning, does not drive on meaninglessness, does not use usury. It is then that we begin to dwell, and as Heidegger reminds us in his essay Building, Dwelling, Thinking, genuine dwelling means to protect the earth. Yet first, we must begin to think. Of course, now an obscene haste rules. Now, more than before perhaps even, to act, to do, to establish a new order of the world so that we can control this virus. It's time to build. But thinking is what we must attempt. First, we must think. We who are, according to Aristotle, if there's still some truth to this, the zoon logon echon, which is not the rational animal, no, which is the living being, zoon, logon echon, logos, which holds itself in logos, which finds a stance in logos. We must gather ourselves to come to our senses, to the genuine human sense, der Menschensinn, which Goethe still remembers. Goethe also reminds us that all that is intelligent has already been thought. What we are to do is to think again through the echoes of truth. Suddenly, now we are thrown back to ourselves, looking for a stance, for something to hold on to. This is what the virus is. The virus is just reminding us of this horror also of existence, of that perhaps we don't have a stance in existence and what it means to be human, which also means to be mortal. This is what the virus is. It's not this extremely lethal, deadly virus that will kill us all and is frightening. No, it's something else. It's just this, it kicks into, it makes us, it reminds us of what we have forgotten, which is that we are mortal beings. And that we are not infinitely capable of controlling the planet as if it were just a simulation. So suddenly we are thrown back to ourselves, looking for a stance, for something to hold on to. We will not find this stance through an obscene haste. We will not find anything to hold on to, a hold with more stuff. We might be able to begin to find a stance, perhaps if we begin to be idle with dignity, which is to say we need to suspend, as if on a wing, for once the pressures of materialism, so that we can begin again to find our being human, to ground ourselves, to come into harmony with the world and ourselves. I would like to quote from Nietzsche's Gay Science, a passage entitled Muße und Müßiggang, Leisure and Idleness. The breathless haste of America with which they work is already beginning to infect old Europe with its ferocity and is spreading a lack of spirit, Geistlosigkeit. Today one is ashamed of resting, and prolonged reflection almost gives people a bad conscience. One thinks with a watch in one's hand, even as one eats one's lunch while reading the latest news of the stock market. One lives as if one always might miss out on something. This is in the 19th century. Rather do anything than nothing. This principle, too, is merely a string to throttle all culture and good taste. And by the way, the ways of the will are to throttle us. The will throttles, it doesn't love. To love means to let something or someone be, to let it occur. It throttles all culture and good taste, just as all forms are visibly perishing by the haste of the workers. The feeling for form itself, the ear and eye for the melody of movements are also perishing. Instead, of course, we are informed. The proof of this may be found in the universal demand for gross obviousness, and all those situations in which human beings wish to be honest with one another for once in their associations with their friends and relatives, etc. One no longer has time or energy for ceremonies, for being obliging in an indirect way, for esprit in conversation, and for any otium at all. It's very important to know what he's saying here, is that if something is too obvious, perhaps, it hasn't got that much to say, and perhaps also that when it gets actually serious with philosophy, many shy away, because it isn't about giving one a fuzzy, nice, warm feeling. Without leisure and without idleness, which again does not mean free time, but finding a stance in existence such that existence is fully embraced, which means also to embrace death and finitude. Without leisure, we are spiritless, we are numb. There is no poetry in such a world, only effectiveness for the sake of effectiveness. All enjoyment is already only relaxation, as if we were an ox under a yoke, a castrated animal carrying a burden it does not see. The question of leisure and idleness, make no mistake, is not some question, again, about what we do in our spare time, and now that we are locked in. No, the question of skole properly and directly concerns itself with the question what it means to be human. To be human is not a fact, it is a job, it's a task. It's something we have to live up to. In 1949, the German Catholic philosopher Joseph Pieper published an essay entitled Muße und Kult. Usually, the title is translated in English as Leisure as the Basis of Culture. Unfortunately, something significant is lost in this translation. Muße is skole, the true spirit of foundational leisure. But kult means worship. Without the divine, we are only ever idolizing ourselves in a fake leisure. True ceremony is only possible with a view to the divine, with sacrifice. In his essay, Pieper reminds his readers of one of the grand traditions of the Occident, namely of its contemplative caste, of those who by meditating and contemplation looked after that which is. This for us is alien. He also reminds us that Heraclitus says that those who dream take part in the busyness of the world, those who sleep. So those who meditate participate in the world. They take care of beings. Those who think take care of what is by their thinking. People feared that we all would become but workers in a world of total work. What does it mean to meditate? One of the oldest sentences of Occidental wisdom comes from Periander. In Greek, melita tanpan. And this means take into care and consideration everything that is insofar that it is. To meditate means to care for beings, deeply and profoundly, meditating, in this is where we get the word medicine from, by the way, in order to perform better at whatever task or to cope with anxiety, is the utter voiding and destruction of the meaning of meditation, and hence one of the pale horses on which nihilism has pillaged our lands. Meditation is not a psychotechnology. Meditation is where we get in touch with the being of beings. It's not something I do to feel better. It's not something I do with my will. Actually, if anyone who meditates in order to deal with anxiety focuses on what? On anxiety. We've lost this sense of meditation. We lost it very early on with the Stoics and with the Christian tradition. It became a measure of the will, but that's just an aside. So let us begin again to direct our sense to the very old ways, our mentioned sin towards the spirit of skole, of true leisure. That is to say, towards the plenty and fullness at the heart of things. For the exuberance of being, the gift that is thinking, the amazement that anything is at all. For then, and only then, out of this schism, I am, there is something. For then and only then can we remember what we have always already been and build towards a genuine future, not some fantasy of total control and effectiveness. We are mortals, after all. By taking again a meditative stance in this old sense of leisure, and by moving beyond utilitarian calculations, perhaps we can begin to get in touch again with our human sense. Consider Heidegger's interpretation of Chuang Tzu's The Useless Tree. The tree no longer bears any fruit, hence the peasant who owns the useless tree wants to cut it down. But Chuang Tzu invites the peasant to begin to see something else in the tree, another possibility. The tree is useless. Nothing of immediate use or yield can be made of it. Still, the tree invites us to sit underneath it, simply in order to sit and so to come to our senses again. This is similar for the meaning of things. One cannot do anything with meaning. Meaning is profoundly useless, effectiveless, without efficiency, especially without any effect or use for the alienating wheelwork, which has as its fuel the meaninglessness of our age and the boredom that we cannot deal with. In fact, one could even go so far as saying that the alienating wheelwork requires meaninglessness for its operations. The useless, though, is that which is beyond utilitarian calculations and which withdraws from them. In a loving relationship with the world, we let things be, we let them occur. Yet, thanks to this withdrawal from utilitarian materialism, for example, other dimensions of meaning begin to occur and open up, in which the instrumental and the utilitarian have no place. True leisure that is grounded in itself and does not serve any operative aim is useless for the operations of the will to will. But as such, true leisure is the source of meaning. For that which is useless and without immediate effect, that is truly untouchable and enduring, and that will endure. Again, for that which is useless and without immediate effect is that which is untouchable and enduring. Everything else will evaporate into the abyss very, very quickly. So thank you very much for listening, as always, and wish you all the best. Keep well.